Welcome back. For the past 8 months, one TV drama has gripped the UK like no other. The inquiry into press conduct by Lord Justice Leveson finished hearing from witnesses just last week. Over 8 months, a wide range of witnesses gave evidence, from the victims of alleged press misconduct to celebrities to prime ministers, past and present, and some of the UK's most powerful media players. Leveson is expected to report back with recommendations to reform press regulation. And one man who's very much across this issue is Professor Duncan Bloy. He's a media law specialist at Cardiff University's School of Journalism, and he's in New Zealand to lecture at the Auckland University of Technology. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Let's just outline, if we can, for a start, the concerns that have led to this Leveson inquiry in the UK.
How long have we got?
Yes, exactly.
I think the biggest single issue was that the print media regulator, the Press Complaints Commission, and the industry at large failed to respond to the warning signs from 2006 through to 2009. So we had information being put into the public domain by the Information Commissioner's Office in relation to the concept of blagging, journalists employing private detectives to get information from public organisations, and sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. Then we had the rogue reporter scandal with Glenn Mulcair on the News of the World. And then we had two what were called whitewash reports from the Press Complaints Commission. And I think it's something that we should think about going forward. If the print media had actually responded positively in 2006, 2007 to the issues that were confronting them, we may never have had Leveson. I think now we're in the situation that the industry has to accept some form of regulation, new form of regulation. I think it needs to embrace that positively as well.
Do you think there was an arrogance, if you like, in the way the print media responded back then?
I think the arrogance actually translates into what you might call issues connected with separation of powers. The police and the media, the print media in particular, the Murdoch Group, and the politicians quite clearly were working too closely together. And I think the arrogance stems from that. You begin to believe that you don't have to respond to the same laws and the same diktats as ordinary people. And I think that's where the problem lay.
It did reveal, if nothing else, the extraordinary relationship, if you like, between Downing Street and leading politicians and the likes of the Sun, because it's a well-known fact, isn't it, that if you get the Sun on side in the UK, then you're halfway there to an election victory, aren't you? How close did this reveal that the relationship between politicians and the media is? And do you think it's more widespread than just within the UK?
It's difficult to actually draw a conclusion about how widespread it is internationally or in Australia or New Zealand. I suspect it's not as close as it was in the UK. Looking at the UK and looking at the key decisions that should have been taken, particularly by the police, I think that's one of the most worrying aspects. That in 2007, after the Information Commissioner's report, and again in 2009, you had senior figures at Scotland Yard saying there's no evidence to take further action, no evidence to take prosecutions. From Leveson, you had information about ex-senior police officers being, once they retired or left the police, being re-employed by News International, huge amounts of money to write columns. There's evidence that perhaps there was nepotism between certain figures in the industry, jobs being provided for their sons and daughters. I think the whole thing was just far, far too close. And the real question then is, well, who actually sorts that out? And I think you have to pay tribute to the judiciary. We have an independent judiciary. They stayed independent. And the key figure in all this was Mr. Justice Voss, who actually ordered discovery of documents from News International in respect of the privacy allegations that were being made, the breach of privacy.
One of the other issues it threw up was the issue of public interest. And what is public interest? And perhaps more importantly, who defines what is in the public's interest?
There's a conventional argument that you have to distinguish between the public interest and what is of interest to the public. And then there is a further debate as to whether does it matter at all that anything that the public is interested in could become public interest concept. A couple of things that I would mention, I think. One is that when you look at cross-media ownership, the public interest in having a broad church of information being put out by the media is clearly important. It's one of the most important factors. The second thing I might mention is that in the UK there's a new development which has taken place as a result of the Crown Prosecution Service recognising that sometimes good investigative journalism will require journalists to stretch the law, if not break the law, perhaps bribing individuals. And the CPS has now produced a new set of guidelines on the factors it would take into account in deciding whether journalists have actually are acting in the public interest in respect of any prosecutions that may or may not be taken. Those interim guidelines will become final guidelines, I think, eventually around October this year. So it may be worth people here having a look at those guidelines as well. When
you talk about journalists who need to stretch the boundaries a little and cross the law, I'd like to sort of raise the issue of what historically also has happened in Ireland, because there is a nation where there's been, tremendous levels of corruption within the government in Dublin. There have been issues surrounding the Troubles, where there's been some amazing investigative journalism there as well. They have an interesting model of regulation, I guess you would say. Can you define what that is for us?
The model is essentially a press council and a press ombudsman. It seems to be very, very simple. The press ombudsman will deal with what you might call everyday complaints in respect of the print media. And the press council there is the backstop organisation that if there are more fundamental generic issues connected with the way journalism is being practised, then it can get involved. But there's one further dimension that as a result of the Defamation Act in Ireland in 2009, whether or not a media organisation has worked with and complied with press council guidelines is a factor that can be taken into account. So there's, in a defamation action, so there's statutory recognition of the organisation, the structure, but not statutory regulation. And I would suggest that that might be a model that Sir Brian Leveson will actually take into account if he proposes to keep this dichotomy between the broadcast regulator and the print media regulator. The more I think about it, the more I think he's unlikely to do that. I think he's likely to suggest that with Ofcom being a backstop, there should be an independent Press Complaints Commission, Press Ombudsman, call it what you will, within that framework. And that will sit by the side of the Advertising Standards Authority as well, as two independent organisations operating independently, but there is a backstop organisation.
So the minute you say regulation, most journalists will, everyone gets the speed wobbles a little bit. Who is best placed to regulate? Is it the state?
No, absolutely not. The best place, it's people who run the industry.
So self-regulation, you mean, journalists?
Well, you can put whatever label you want on, but it comes down to organisations. The media is no different, for example, to the public utilities. It's no different to the banks. Boards have responsibilities, directors have responsibilities, and I think another of the interesting things is going to be what Brian Leveson says about ethics. And we in the journalism schools, we think that he will say there should be a compulsory ethics module that we will have to teach to aspiring journalists. But I firmly believe that structures are not critically important. It comes down to the integrity of the people within those organisations, and as far as the media is concerned, as long as their journalists are acting responsibly and in the public interest, then things should be okay.
So that in itself throws up challenges, doesn't it? Particularly in today's industry, where you're not waiting for a newspaper to come out tomorrow. There's online. Everybody is going. They want to be first, and you will, crawl over your firstborn child, God love it, to get that story. Well, that's the reality, certainly, that we see here at times. Journalists. And in the UK, there's a desperate need, they feel, to be first with a story and to retain their exclusiveness on that story. So how do you then say to those journalists at times, ethics sometimes do get pushed to one side, don't they?
They do. It makes life very, very difficult. And I think there's a subtext that we could introduce here, and that is the PR industry and how far regulation should affect the PR industry. I'm not sure if it's the same here in New Zealand, but a report in the UK in 2012, February 2012, is saying there are now more PR practitioners than journalists in the UK, and it's increasingly common for journalists just to buy into the press releases and the PR copy that comes down the line. And so I think there's a secondary issue, and that is, should we actually go further with regulation and also try to embrace the PR industry as well?
It's a similar situation here. I think there are more press secretaries than there are political journalists in the gallery. How do you think the landscape in Britain could change? Because for so long, the Brits have been held up as, the great broadcasters, among the world's great journalists.
Sure.
How do you think that will change post-Leveson Enquiry?
I don't think it needs to change very much. The criticisms have not been against the broadcast media. The criticisms have not been against the regional press, nor the local press. It's really been one or two newspapers and one particular group which has been driving all the problems that we've seen over the last few years. There is still integrity in the industry. There are still scoops to be had. I don't think the industry needs to be overly concerned about what Leveson is going to recommend, because quite clearly the terms of reference say that nothing should affect the freedom of the press as we know it. I think the industry should be concentrating on the big issues. That's the commercial viability of newspapers, the spread of digital, the convergence issues. Those are the things that the media should be looking at. I don't think there are any serious problems going forward with the industries in the UK.
Fascinating. We do have to leave it there, sadly. Professor Duncan Bloy, very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.